The sky above the desert world of Eridra was a burning shade of orange with long red clouds, stretching across the horizon like fire trails in the wind, and the sand below was golden, but hot and sharp, like powdered glass. Mark was used to Earth's cooler winds and blue skies, but he had grown to adapt to this alien heat because he had a purpose, and that purpose was to explore. Mark was one of the few humans who lived among the native Eridrans, a tall, slim people with dark blue skin and glowing eyes, and though they were advanced in many ways, they lived quietly and avoided any contact with ancient places buried in their lands. Among them was a girl named Lyra. She was curious more than most of her kind, and unlike others, she wasn't afraid of stories that the elders whispered about the desert places, stories of cursed structures built by unknown hands. Long before her people walked the sands, she had seen the strange markings on an old stone years ago, and since then she had always believed something powerful was hidden beyond the dunes. That belief led her to Mark. She knew that humans were different, that they didn't fear the ancient, like the Eridrans did, and Mark, with his worn gear, dusty boots, and endless questions, had become the perfect companion for what she had in mind. That morning, under the harsh twin suns, Lyra met Mark near the edge of the settlement. Without speaking, she handed him a wrapped scroll. It was old and faded, showing lines drawn over the desert, and a symbol at the end of the trail. It took him a moment to realize it was a pyramid. She didn't explain much, only said that the place was real, and that no Eridran had ever entered it, that some who went looking never returned, and that her people now avoided the region entirely. But Mark's eyes lit up curiosity, driving his thoughts faster than caution. He agreed at once, and within hours, they had set off with supplies on 2 old sand gliders that buzzed through the wind like humming machines from another age. As they moved across the endless dunes, Mark felt something different in the air, not just the heat, but a kind of tension like the world itself held its breath and watched them. For 3 days they rode over the shifting sands, stopping only when the sun dipped below the horizon and the cold nights took over. Lyra kept silent most of the way, but her eyes watched the sky often, and her fingers sometimes traced the pendant around her neck. It was shaped like a triangle with soft lines carved into it, glowing faintly whenever they neared certain stone outcrops. Mark noticed and asked her about it, but she only said it had belonged to her grandmother and that it guided her. Here on the 4th day they reached a ridge, and beyond it the desert fell away into a wide basin, and in the center of that basin, half buried under layers of sand, was the top of a black pyramid. It didn't shine in the sun, it absorbed the light like a hole in the sky, and its surface seemed smoother than stone, without cracks or age. Mark stepped forward slowly, his breath caught not from the heat, but from awe. He had seen ruins before, broken temples, shattered towers, even buried cities. But this was something else. This felt alive. Lyra didn't move closer. Instead, she stood near the edge as if some invisible line kept her back, her voice low when she said this place was older than time, and that the air around it sometimes whispered when no one was near. Mark looked at her. She looked scared, truly scared, not just cautious, and he realized then that her people must have believed in something real. He asked her why she brought him, and her answer was simple: because the pyramid would not open for her kind, but it might for his. She told him that long ago the oldest stories spoke of travelers from beyond the stars, ones who left behind machines and doors, and that those doors responded to blood, not of Eridra, but from somewhere else. Mark's heartbeat quickened. The idea that this place recognized species or genetics seemed wild, but not impossible, not after all he had seen on other planets. Approached the structure, its base still buried, but its peak and a wide face exposed. The carvings on its side were deep and strange swirls, mixed with sharp lines and angles, and though they made no sense to him, they felt strangely familiar. He reached out his hand just inches from the surface. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but anticipation, as if something in him already knew what would happen. Lyra called out one last time, told him he could still turn back, that once touched the pyramid changed people, or worse. But Mark didn't stop. His palm touched the black stone, and everything around him changed. The sky above flickered like a dying signal. Waves of energy pulsed from the pyramid into the ground, making the sand ripple like water. The light bent and twisted. Shadows danced where none should exist, and a low hum began to rise not from outside, but from deep within the structure. As if something inside had felt his presence and was waking up. Mark felt the hum enter his body like a slow wind moving through his bones. Not painful, not harsh, but heavy like 1,000 thoughts pressing into his mind. Lyra gasped as the pendant around her neck glowed brighter, then dimmed. Mark's eyes turned upward, and for a moment he saw a flash in the sky like a star blinking that hadn't been there before. Then silence. The light faded, the humming stopped, and the pyramid now pulsed slowly like a heart beating in stone. Mark stepped back, but the stone under his hand had left a mark. A faint glow where his skin met the surface, and even though he had let go, the mark remained. He turned to Lyra, his face pale, but his eyes wide with wonder, and she looked at him not as a companion, but as something changed behind them. Far across the dunes, a tall figure watched and disappeared into the sand. And so it began. The silence that followed was deep like a thick blanket, stretched over the land. The winds that once howled now paused, as though the entire desert was waiting, watching, holding its breath. And Mark stood still before the black pyramid, feeling a strange heat under his skin, not like fire but like memory, like something inside him was no longer asleep. Lyra approached slowly, her steps unsure, her voice low, asking him if he was all right. And Mark nodded, but he could not explain what he felt. His mind was full of strange pictures. Not visions exactly, but hints of something. Ancient voices not speaking in words, but in feelings, and a deep pull toward the pyramid's heart. He turned toward Lyra, and she looked different, not because she had changed, but because something in him had, and now he saw more. He noticed the faint shimmer in her eyes, the energy in the pendant that hung around her neck, and the way her body moved like she was connected to this land in ways he had never understood before. She whispered that the pyramid had awakened and that it had accepted him, and Mark asked her what that meant, but even she did not know. They stood there for a while, surrounded by the dead calm of the desert, until Lyra pointed to a shape in the sand, a wide flat stone that had once been buried, but now had risen, as though pushed upward by the pulse of the pyramid. It was carved with deep lines, the same style as those on the structure, and Mark felt drawn to it. Knelt and touched the stone, and this time the carvings did not just glow, they shifted, they changed, and reformed into symbols that he could almost read. It was not language in the way he knew it, but more like images placed into his head. Thoughts forming pictures that told of an old time, a time when beings came from the stars and built things meant to last longer than memory. Lyra watched him carefully. She had never seen the symbols move before, never seen them speak, and now her fear was mixed with awe. Mark stood and looked back at the pyramid, his hand still tingling from the touch, and deep inside the structure a sound echoed. It was not loud, but it felt strong, like a distant drumbeat calling someone home. Lyra said they should leave, that this place had been quiet for hundreds of years, and now that quiet was broken, and others would come. But Mark shook his head because something inside him whispered that they were meant to go deeper, that the pyramid was not just an object but a gate, and that he had only opened the first lock. They circled the base, searching for a way in, and found a smooth, dark line across the side of the structure, almost invisible, but now faintly glowing. As they stepped closer, the line expanded slowly, and without noise a section of the pyramid shifted and opened, revealing a dark hallway leading inward. The air from within was cold and dry, and smelled like old metal and forgotten rain. Mark looked to Lyra once more, and she nodded, though her body was tense and her hands curled slightly like she was preparing for something heavy. They stepped inside, and the hallway lit up with soft lines of blue that followed them as they moved. The walls were strange, not stone, not metal, but something between, and covered in those same symbols that pulsed faintly with each of Mark's steps. They walked deeper, and the hallway opened into a wide chamber with a ceiling So high it faded into shadow. In the center was a raised platform, and above it hovered a shape, a sphere made of shifting light, slowly rotating and surrounded by rings of floating pieces that moved without touching. Mark approached the sphere, and the moment he came near, it stopped spinning, and a light beam reached out, touching his chest. It didn't burn, but it sent a wave of cold through his body, and in that moment he saw more. He saw images of Earth not as it was, but as it had once been, green and wild and surrounded by massive structures, now lost under oceans and ice. And he saw humans not primitive, but strong, connected to machines and stars and building things far beyond what existed now. Then the vision changed and showed ships fleeing battles, worlds being destroyed, and messages being buried in places like this pyramid. When it ended, Mark stumbled back, gasping, and Lyra caught him, her voice urgent, asking what he saw, and he told her everything. She listened quietly, her hands shaking, and said that her people were wrong, that the pyramid was not a curse, but a message, and that Mark was part of something far greater. But not everyone would believe that she said her brother, Turak, had followed them from the settlement, that he feared humans would bring destruction, and that, if he found them here, he would try to stop them no matter what it meant. Mark stood and looked at the sphere again, and it now floated lower, almost within reach, and he understood it was not done with him. He reached out and touched it, and the room lit up with moving light beams that mapped out the stars, showing paths and names and signals. Blinking across the galaxy, one point shone brighter than the rest. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and Mark felt that it was calling him. Lyra looked at the star map and her breath caught. She said that place was forbidden among her kind, called the Void Eye, a dark place in the sky that no one ever approached. Mark said maybe it was time to go there and find out what the past had hidden, and Lyra, though unsure, said she would go with him because something in her had changed too. Outside, the sun was setting, and the pyramid's walls now glowed softly, like it was alive and waiting. Far beyond the dunes, a figure watched through old lenses and whispered into a device, saying the human had awakened the gate, and that the others must be told. The stars above twinkled brighter that night, as if listening. Night fell heavy over the desert as the last glow of light faded behind the dunes, and the stars above shimmered like a scattered field of ancient watchers. The black pyramid stood quietly, but no longer felt silent. Its surface pulsed faintly, as if something deep inside had begun to breathe. Mark stood at the entrance, staring into the dark where the star map had floated, and even though the light had vanished from the chamber, the image remained clear in his mind, the pattern of glowing paths across the galaxy, the heartbeat signal blinking from the place called the Void Eye. It was not just a name, it felt like a warning, or maybe an invitation. Lyra sat close by, her eyes wide, but thoughtful, her voice soft when she spoke. She had grown up hearing only fear about the pyramid, yet here she was beside a human who had touched it, awakened it, and still lived, not cursed, not lost, but changed in a way that frightened her and yet pulled her closer. She asked him what he felt when the sphere had connected with him, and Mark tried to explain, but the words were not enough. He spoke of visions of Earth, long forgotten, of cities in the clouds, and voices speaking not in sound, but in memory, as if he had become a doorway through which ancient knowledge had returned. Lyra listened and did not speak for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded cloth, carefully opening it to reveal a round stone, smooth and blue, with the same kind of symbols etched across its surface. It had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through the generations, and never understood. She said it had once glowed in her grandmother's hands, but not in hers. Mark took the stone gently, and the moment it touched his skin, the symbols began to shine, softly pulsing like a slow rhythm, and Lyra gasped, as if seeing magic for the first time. He held it tighter and felt a wave of warmth move through his chest, like the stone recognized him and offered something more. It was not just a tool, it was a key, one of many left behind by a race that had vanished or hidden, or perhaps changed into something else. Mark now believed that humans were not newcomers to the stars, but survivors scattered long ago and made to forget. As the two sat beside the pyramid, the ground beneath them trembled, Just slightly, and a deep sound rumbled from below, not violent but steady. Like the pyramid had turned another layer of its mechanisms awake. Far off beyond the hills, a small group of shadows moved quietly across the dunes, guided by Turek, who had followed his sister for days. He had seen the pyramid's light from afar, and now brought others from the settlement, armed and wary. They believed the ancient stories of doom and ruin, and now feared what Lyra and the human might bring back inside the pyramid. Mark explored further, finding another hallway that led downward. And as he walked, the walls began to glow, showing images not in drawings, but in moving light figures of tall beings with long arms, standing beside humans, machines flying above vast landscapes, devices planted in worlds like seeds waiting to grow. When called, the hallway led him to a smaller chamber where a pedestal stood, and upon it rested a narrow band, shaped like a bracelet made of dark metal with blue lines. Moving across its surface, he reached for it, and as his fingers closed around it, the band wrapped itself around his wrist, locking into place, and then fading into his skin as if it had never been separate. Mark cried out, not from pain but from shock, and Lyra rushed to him, but he held up his hand and said he was fine though. His heart beat like thunder, and his thoughts now felt larger, as if more than his own filled his mind. He began to understand parts of the star map and words from an ancient tongue that he had never learned, but now somehow knew. He said the pyramid was one of many, and that each one contained knowledge waiting for those who could awaken it. Lyra stepped back as her pendant started glowing again, not just lightly but burning with color and heat, and then without warning the outer wall of the pyramid flashed and opened like a doorway made of light, and Mark and Lyra stepped through it into another space, not underground, but open and filled with strange light. They found themselves standing in a circular room with no visible roof, only stars above, and in the center a column of floating crystals spinning slowly and humming with low sound. The crystals projected more images, now showing the void eye not as a dead place, but as a dark station orbiting a collapsed star, a place built as a final fortress where the last of the builders had hidden. Mark watched and saw himself reflected in the image, surrounded by light, and Lyra by his side, and in that moment he understood that they were not just travelers or explorers. They had become something more. Then the image shifted and showed ships moving near the void eye, dark ships without light, moving like insects but with purpose. And they were not friendly. They had awoken too, drawn by the same signal that Mark had triggered. And they were coming not to protect but to destroy. The crystals dimmed and Mark turned to Lyra, saying they had to go to the void. Not later, but now, before those ships arrived. He felt time slipping fast, and the longer they waited, the more danger would spread. Lyra agreed, though fear trembled in her voice, and she asked how they would travel such a distance. And Mark looked down at the bracelet now hidden in his skin, and said he did not know yet, but something inside him did. Outside the chamber, the ground trembled again, louder this time, and the pyramid's outer shell closed as if preparing for rest. And at that moment, a voice echoed through the chamber, not from any speaker, but from within their minds, telling them that the first seal had been broken, and the path was open. Mark held Lyra's hand for the first time, their fingers locking without words, as the desert winds roared outside, and the stars above shimmered like signals waiting for their answer. And somewhere far across the galaxy, the void eye began to blink. Again, the wind outside was growing faster and louder, as if the desert itself had sensed something was shifting deep below, and Mark could feel it too, not just in the pyramid around him, but inside his body, in the rhythm of his breath, and in the weight behind his thoughts. The bracelet no longer felt foreign. It pulsed quietly against his skin, like it was part of him. Now no longer a tool, but something living. Lyra walked beside him, her pendant glowing softly with each step, and the silence between them was full of meaning. Words were no longer needed, because they both knew the path ahead would not be simple or safe. They moved through another corridor revealed by the moving walls of the pyramid, and it opened into a lower chamber, unlike the others. This one was built of dark stone, and the floor was covered with carvings so detailed they looked alive. The air was cold, but still the lights on the walls began to pulse as soon as Mark stepped. Forward in the center of the room stood a tall structure, like a vertical mirror made of polished black glass, surrounded by 4 pillars that each held a sphere of light. When Mark placed his hand near the mirror, the glass shimmered and began to show moving images like a window into another time. He saw a planet, not Earth, but something older, green skies and twin moon cities, stretched across the surface, glowing with power, and humans, walking side by side with tall beings dressed in silver robes. The builders, their shapes were strange, but their faces kind. They showed humans how to build not just cities, but starships. Knowledge that moved through thought, and structures that grew like trees. The image shifted and showed war, not of anger, but of fear. A threat came not from the builders, not from humans, but from the edge of known space. Machines with no voices, only functions. They consumed light and fed on life. They came without warning and moved without pause. Mark saw ships fall and stars darken. He saw planets erased and data buried, and in the final moments, the builders gathered the last of the humans and scattered them across the galaxy, placing memory inside structures like the pyramid, protected by time and fear. The mirror faded, and Mark stepped back as the truth settled in his chest. Humans were not weak, not new, not accidental. They were survivors of a war forgotten by history, and the pyramid was never meant to be feared, but to awaken the ones left behind. Lyra looked at him, her face full of quiet shock and her voice low as she said that her people had believed the pyramid was cursed because the stories had been told in fear, not understanding, and that perhaps her ancestors had chosen to forget the truth rather than face the pain of it. Mark turned to the mirror again, and now the symbols on the floor began to move, shifting into lines that formed a map like the one he had seen before, but this one showed paths between the pyramids, scattered across many worlds, and each one now blinking with new light. The signal had reached them. Then came a sound, not from the pyramid, but from outside. The sharp cry of a horn, followed by the rush of feet on sand, and both Mark and Lyra knew what it meant. Tarek had arrived, and he had brought others. They ran back through the corridor just as the entrance opened, and the light from outside flooded in. Standing in the glow were 6 figures led by Tarek, whose eyes were full of fire and fear. His voice thundered, asking what Mark had done, and Lyra stepped in front of him, her voice steady, telling her brother that the stories were wrong, that the pyramid held truth, not death. Tarek did not listen. He raised a weapon and aimed it at Mark, and for a moment, time seemed to slow, but before he could fire, the ground shook hard, and a beam of blue light shot from the top of the pyramid into the sky, creating a line so bright it turned the night into day. All stopped and looked up, and in the sky something responded. A distant shimmer in the stars moved like a ripple, and then came a pulse that spread across the sky. Tarek lowered his weapon, confused, and Mark stepped forward, showing the bracelet and the symbols glowing across his arm. He spoke clearly, telling them that this was not destruction, but activation, that the pyramid had chosen him to carry its message and awaken what was lost. Lyra stood beside him and said the old fears had no place now, and that they had to decide whether to hide from the truth or follow it into something greater. Tarek hesitated. The others looked at each other, and for the first time doubt replaced their anger. Then the pyramid's surface began to shift again, and a staircase formed, leading downward, a path that had not been there before, as if offering a choice. Mark looked to Lyra, and without a word they stepped forward and began to descend. The others stayed behind, but did not stop them. The stairs led to the deepest chamber, yet a round room carved in glowing lines that flowed like water, and in the center floated a device, small and simple, but heavy with energy. Mark touched it, and instantly his mind was filled with instructions, not just thoughts, but knowledge, step by step. How to reach the Void Eye, how to access the star paths, and how to activate the other pyramids. Chamber shook, and the device melted into light that sank into Mark's chest. His heart beat harder, and he knew he had become more than a messenger. He was now a key, not just to memory, but to power meant to protect and restore. Lyra asked, "What now?" and Mark said it was time to leave this planet and find the next pyramid because others would be searching. Too, not just those who wanted truth, but those who wanted to stop it above them. The light beam still rose high, and in orbit around Eridra, old satellites began to wake systems forgotten by time came online, and a name long erased appeared again, the first beacon, and the stars whispered once more. The morning light spread across the desert like liquid fire, soaking the dunes in gold, but the sky above Eridra was no longer the same. The pulse from the pyramid had changed it. The beam of blue light that stretched high into the atmosphere still shimmered, as if it were connecting this ancient world to something far beyond the stars. And the winds carried not just sand, but whispers of awakening. Mark stood at the peak of the pyramid, his eyes staring upward where the signal vanished into the heavens. His body felt different, not just stronger but more aware, as though every breath he took was part of a larger rhythm. The bracelet on his arm no longer glowed, yet its presence was deep under his skin, a quiet reminder that something vast had chosen him. Lyra stood beside him, watching the sky, her pendant calm now, no longer pulsing with heat but warm like a heartbeat close to her chest. The truth they had uncovered inside the pyramid still echoed in her thoughts, images of humans walking beside ancient beings, building ships and cities, and machines that could speak through memory and time. Below them, the Eridran scouts who had come with Tarek now waited in silence. Their anger had faded, replaced by wonder and confusion. None of them had ever seen the pyramid open. None of them had ever heard its voice or seen its light, and now they understood that the stories told in fear were only shadows of a greater truth. Tarek himself stood apart, his expression torn between guilt and disbelief. His hands empty, now his weapon buried in the sand where he had dropped it during the awakening. He had watched his sister speak, not with doubt but with clarity, and seen the human stand, not as a conqueror but as something older, something chosen. And in that moment his fear had begun to break. Mark spoke without turning, his voice low but firm, saying that the signal had reached others, and not all who heard it would come in peace. He said that the machines from the visions were not gone, only silent, and now that the pyramids were waking, so too might the old threats. Lyra asked what they must do next, and Mark looked down at the small floating orb that had emerged from the pyramid's inner chamber. It hovered near his shoulder, glowing gently like it waited for a command. The map it displayed showed many worlds connected through old paths, star bridges built long ago, and most of them still quiet. But one was blinking fast, a red light pulsing like a distress call. It was the void. Mark said they needed to go there to activate what was left, to warn those who had forgotten, and to protect what remained of the builders' legacy. The Eridrans offered no protest, they only watched as the human and the girl descended the steps. Again, this time, not as trespassers, but as bearers of a purpose. They returned to the outpost, the journey across the dunes silent and smooth, the sand gliders moving as if guided by the wind itself. And when they reached the edge of the settlement, Mark saw how even the land had changed. The trees glowed faintly, the stones hummed low, and the air carried strange vibrations, as though the activation of the pyramid had stirred the world's roots inside the hidden hangar where old ships were kept. Mark found the vessel he had arrived in, once slow and nearly dead, now surrounded by machines that moved on their own small arms, repairing the structure, power flowing through the hull like the ship had tasted the pyramid's energy and begun to heal itself. Lyra looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty and courage, and asked if she truly belonged with him on this path, if her place was among stars and ruins and battles waiting in the dark. Mark answered, not with promise, but with truth, saying that she had been chosen just as he had been, not by fate, but by action, that she had walked into the pyramid with open eyes and refused to turn away, and that such choice had power. Together they prepared the ship, and when it lifted from the ground, the skies above Eridra shimmered in welcome. The beam from the pyramid, now pulsing in slow waves as though saying farewell and good luck. The journey through space was long and filled with silence, but it was not empty. The orb guided them along forgotten paths, through tunnels of light that bent stars around them, and as they traveled, Mark began to understand more. The bracelet on his arm, feeding him knowledge from a source that never slept. He learned how the builders had encoded memory into light, how the pyramids spoke to each other through gravity and sound, and how the void I was once the final shield between the stars and the darkness that hunted them. They reached it on the edge of a system where the sun had collapsed into a black sphere surrounded by silver rings orbiting like broken clocks. The void I stood in the shadow of that collapsed star, a massive station, shaped like an eye turned toward the abyss with no lights and no movement. But as their ship approached, the station flickered once, then again. Then all at once the surface came alive, lights racing across its spine, old defenses activating not to attack but to welcome. And when they docked, the doors opened without a word inside. They found more than ruins. They found stasis pods holding records of the last builder's machines still waiting for orders, and a central core that pulsed when Mark entered and scanned his presence. The final message played, a voice neither human nor Eridran, but vast and old and calm. It spoke of war and silence, and the hope that one day a seed would bloom again and find this place. And now it had. Mark placed his hand on the console, and the void eye lit fully, its systems awakening across all levels, and its signal sent once more across the stars, calling other pyramids, other guardians, and other humans who might still remember. Lyra stood at his side, and together they watched the galaxy map unfold across the chamber, not in dots or lines, but in living motion. Stars dancing like breath, and among them lights began to shine one by one, humans from different corners, drawn by the same call. The galaxy was no longer quiet. The pyramid had spoken, and humanity had answered. The end